What if one day you discovered that your entire life was built on a lie? That the love, the pride, even the legacy of your family, was all carefully designed to hide a truth so dark it could destroy everything you believed in. This isn't just a story, this is the truth of Wexley House, where blood didn't stop at a single corpse, and every wall held a secret. And the most terrifying part, that secret has just awakened. It was a damp, hesitant Wednesday morning when the letter arrived, its envelope pale and slightly crumpled as if it had traveled far through hands unsure of its purpose. The ink, however, was fresh, each flourish deliberate, elegant, and strangely ceremonial, as though the writer had crafted every word with a trembling kind of urgency. Miss Alira Westbury, poised at her modest breakfast table in the front bay window of her ivy-wrapped cottage in Lower Dorrington, glanced at the envelope, with a flicker of restrained curiosity. Formal correspondence was uncommon these days, especially of the social variety. Her tea had barely cooled when she carefully sliced it open with the edge of her butter knife, her letter opener misplaced days ago but never sought out. Inside was an invitation, an ornate, cream-colored card, embossed in faded gold and written by a hand she hadn't seen in decades. Rosalind Merriweather, once an acquaintance from a church charity circle that had dissolved like sugar in tea after a string of whispered scandals. You are most warmly invited, the letter read, to the wedding of my beloved niece Celestine Vane, at Windmere Hollow. Alira blinked. Windmere Hollow. That name stirred something, like the echo of a dream half remembered, a house known more for what it had hidden than what it had revealed. The note continued, "It would mean so much to us if you would attend." The phrasing felt oddly strained, not like an invitation, but a summons cloaked in civility. Alira had no real relationship with Celestine, and Rosalind had long drifted from her social periphery. Why now? Why her? Still, as a woman attuned to the subtle vibrations of human behavior, Alira felt something hidden between the lines, something pleading and frayed. By noon she had resolved to attend, not from politeness, but because something inside her whispered that Windmere Hollow had secrets it wished someone to see. The road to the estate curled through a landscape of reluctant spring, the trees skeletal but budding, the hedgerows heavy with moisture and silence. As Windmere Hollow finally appeared through a veil of mist, it struck her not as a home, but as a monument, its stone facade mottled with ivy, its windows dark and watchful, a house that had known grief and chosen to bury it beneath layers of etiquette and roses. A maid answered the door, her eyes wide and unsure, fingers twisting her apron in the universal language of the frightened. Inside, the air was thick, not with the jubilant chaos of wedding preparations, but with a stillness that felt carefully maintained, as if any loud sound might shatter a fragile illusion. The front hall was grand but dim, filled with furniture that belonged to another era and a scent of old wood and lavender that couldn't quite mask the damp. Over the hearth hung a portrait of a woman with eyes like sharpened glass, her expression severe, lips pursed in permanent judgment. Alira felt her gaze cling like dust. Moments later Rosalind swept in, her voice warm but strained at the edges, her hands never quite still, fluttering like birds startled too many times. She led Alira into the drawing room where introductions were made. Celestine, the bride, ethereal and nervously radiant, her laugh always half a beat late, and eyes forever flickering toward the staircase. Jasper, her brother, tall and handsome, with the kind of stillness that unnerved, a man who answered only when addressed and never more than necessary. And a cousin, Aurelia, Audra, whose name Alira immediately forgot, though the coldness in her stare lingered like perfume. Tea was served in china so delicate Alira feared it would splinter in her hand, and conversations drifted like smoke. Pleasant, purposeless and brittle. Alira, ever the observer, said little. Her ears, however, were tuned to every pause, every shift in tone, every silence that screamed louder than words. Lady Verena, Celestine's mother, was conspicuously absent, not feeling quite herself today, someone mumbled, and yet Alira caught the sidelong glance exchanged between the housekeeper and the cousin, a glance that spoke not of illness, but of something heavier. Later, while seated beside the vicar's wife, a woman with an eager tongue and a fondness for whispered ruin, Alira heard the truth laced in hushed awe. "She's wearing her aunt's dress," the one meant for her before the lake took her. Alira's knitting paused for a fraction of a second. Deaths by misadventure were common enough in estates this old, but wedding dresses don't carry stories unless they were once soaked in sorrow. As the hours passed, Alira moved quietly from room to room like a ghost that the house had almost forgotten to fear. She watched as Celestine checked her reflection with a desperation that bordered on dread, how Jasper remained poised like a statue guarding a tomb, and how Rosalind's smile cracked more with each passing minute. The housekeeper lingered near doorways with eyes that saw everything but revealed nothing. The tension wasn't just in the air, it was in the floorboards, the walls, the way the chandeliers barely swung, but never settled. And Alira, silent and still as a needlepoint matron, knew that this wasn't just a wedding, it was a performance stitched over a tragedy not yet resolved. She didn't need voices to hear the truth, it was in the pacing, in the unfinished conversations, in the empty chair at the table set for six. Something had happened here, something that had never been fully buried, and now, with the ceremony looming, it was rising, inch by inch, breath by breath, a presence dressed in lace and vengeance, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. In houses like this, where ivy clung to the stone like secrets to memory, weddings and funerals often blurred together, one promising a beginning, the other demanding an end, yet both with a talent for unearthing things best left buried. Long forgotten feuds, whispered scandals, and silenced truths crept back into the light, as if summoned by the occasion, and this particular morning held a stillness too taut to be innocent. What unsettled Miss Eldora Finch the most wasn't the brittle smiles or sidelong glances shared between cousins who hadn't spoken in years, nor was it the forced laughter that cracked like thin ice over deep water. It was the dress, the bridal gown. No one seemed willing to acknowledge. The dress that belonged to Lillian Hawthorne, the bride-to-be, a garment stitched not just with lace, but with a history so jagged it might as well have been made from glass. By the time the last slice of currant loaf had vanished, and the grandfather clock groaned into the next hour, Miss Finch knew this would be no ordinary wedding, and if no one else dared peel back the layers of pleasantry to find out why, she certainly would. The first scream came just before sunrise, not loud but sharp enough to fracture the hush that blanketed the hall. It was the maid Clara trembling at the foot of the stairs, clutching the gown like it might burn her hands. A rust-colored stain had bloomed across the bodice, stark against the ivory silk, unmistakable in shape and intent, a streak of old blood, dry yet accusing, placed precisely over the heart. Guests gathered like moths to disaster, teacups abandoned mid-sip, chairs scraped back hastily, voices rising in confusion and denial. Lillian gasped when she saw it, hands flying to her lips, her reflection in the glass door suddenly looking like a ghost. Her brother Henry stood rigid beside the fireplace, but Miss Finch noted that his eyes weren't on his sister, they were fixed on the groundskeeper outside, who paused mid-step the moment he spotted the dress. The aunt, Eleanor, offered a feeble theory of mischief, her words swimming in a voice too light, too eager to redirect attention. Someone suggested a vindictive joke, perhaps by an ex-lover or bitter cousin, but their nervous eyes darted toward the corridor as if fearing someone might overhear. Then came the murmurs. The dress was cursed, some said, woven with the grief of the bride's mother who had worn it once and never lived to take it off. But curses are convenient scapegoats when guilt festers just beneath the surface. And Miss Finch, knitting idle loops in her lap, saw beyond the panic to the performances hidden in plain sight. Henry's grip on his brandy glass was too tight, his knuckles bone white. The cousin Beatrice, always the one with the sharp tongue, kept wringing her lace gloves until the fabric tore. And Lillian herself wept in bursts that felt too measured, as though she listened more than she mourned. The gown was no mere fabric, it was a message, one etched in silence and unveiled in blood, and the house reacted not with shock but with recognition. By midday, the drawing rooms divided like territories, every face guarded, every greeting laced with suspicion. Miss Finch watched the gardener's daughter slip a letter beneath a door, saw the old butler fumble with a locked drawer in the sideboard, and heard the pianist's fingers stall just long enough to mark a name. A wedding dress had been defiled, yes, but it was not a prank. It was a reckoning, long overdue, and someone within these walls had sown that stain with intent, knowing precisely what old ghosts they meant to stir. And if Miss Finch had learned anything in her quiet years, it was this: people will do almost anything to hide the past. But blood, even when dried, has a way of speaking louder than any vow ever whispered at the altar. The house loomed like a relic of old sins, its halls lined with portraits that seemed to watch rather than simply hang, and the air thick with something unspoken, something ancient that clung to every doorknob and velvet curtain like dust never swept. The occasion was a wedding, yes, but beneath the delicate lace and forced smiles, everyone could feel it, a pulse, steady and foreboding, like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. Isolde the bride, moved as if walking through water, every step deliberate, every smile too brittle, her gaze flickering with the haunted look of someone who'd glimpsed a future they desperately wished to unsee. The blood-stained dress appeared before the morning light had fully warmed the east wing, discovered not draped with reverence but stuffed behind a chest in the sewing room, its satin bodice marred by a dark, spreading bloom that no one could explain, but everyone silently acknowledged. The housemaid who found it trembled, but spoke nothing, as though the house itself forbade loud reactions, and when she brought it to the others, the guests and family alike reacted with a mix of denial and dread, each one more concerned with how it might be perceived than what it might mean. Isolde wept, yes, but even that sorrow seemed rehearsed, as though her true emotions had been buried weeks ago beneath the weight of obligation, scandal, or both. Eleanor Vance, seated as ever in her quiet corner with knitting unmoved in her lap, watched it all unfold with the calm of someone who had long known how violence often arrived dressed in lace and pearls. And then there was the missing item, an ornate ceremonial knife once used for generations to cut wedding cakes in the family, now gone from its velvet cradle in the cabinet near the servants' stairs. No mention of it was made, not even a whisper, but its absence screamed louder than any confrontation could have. The chapel ceremony, rather than sacred or joyous, felt more like a pageant of fear. The vicar's words fell into an echoing hollow, Isolde's vows stumbled, and her bouquet trembled like a confession, while the groom, handsome and rigid, held her hand with a grip too firm to be comforting. When he kissed her, it felt obligatory, a performance to seal a pact neither believed in. The guests clapped, but even their applause rang like an echo in a tomb. At the reception, silver trays gleamed under the chandelier, like weapons laid bare, laughter clattered instead of flowed, and every toast felt like a farewell rather than a celebration. Isolde's brother stood too still, too silent, eyes never meeting anyone's directly, while their aunt fluttered from guest to guest, speaking quickly, smiling too wide, and watching everyone as if waiting for someone to break. Eleanor, eyes, sharp beneath her placid exterior, caught every movement, the way the cook whispered to the groundskeeper when they thought no one noticed, the way the cellar door had been quietly bolted twice that afternoon, the way Isolde's gaze kept returning, not to her new husband, but to the window, as if wondering if someone would arrive, or escape. The blood, the missing knife, the fear braided into every interaction, these were not isolated anomalies. They were the continuation of a long unresolved horror, echoes of a secret so deeply embedded into the fabric of this family, that it could no longer stay buried. Eleanor, composed yet electric beneath the surface, understood then with clarity chilling in its finality. This was no beginning, and no true ending, merely the next chapter in a tale of betrayal and consequence, and the house, patient and vengeful, had just begun to speak again. No one could quite say when the celebration had shifted from festivity to foreboding. Perhaps it was never a true celebration at all, merely a fragile illusion strung together by obligation, fear, and the desperate hope that old sins could be buried beneath confetti and cake. The music played on, a soft waltz unraveling like a lie, told too many times, and conversations fluttered just above whispers, brittle and rehearsed, as though everyone feared that speaking too loudly might shatter the thin glass of civility, holding the day together. The bride and groom, beautiful and distant, stood like wax figures from a forgotten tableau, their smiles stretched too tightly, hands never quite touching, Two strangers pretending to be in love for the benefit of a room that pretended not to notice. Miss Elspeth Hartley, shrouded in her habitual shawl, that smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs, sat unmoving near the fireplace, but her eyes missed nothing. They moved with surgical precision, dissecting glances, tracing lies sewn into silk hemlines and champagne bubbles. It was in the things unsaid, the glances too quickly broken, the smiles that died just before reaching the eyes, where the truth clung like mildew on old walls. Near the window, the woman in the sky-blue dress, flimsy fluttering, too youthful for her age and station, flinched when her hand grazed that of the balding man beside her, both pulling away so quickly a spoon toppled, and rang against the floor, unnoticed by all but Elspeth. The groom's brother, already adrift in alcohol, avoided looking at the hearth entirely, where the re-hung portrait of the bride's late father smiled serenely, concealing a fresh crack in the wall, a flaw born not from decay, but from violence, as Elspeth suspected. The air itself seemed to contract, thick with memory and malice. Then came Mrs. Linley, powdered and perfumed to near suffocation, her breath warm with gossip as she leaned in to whisper of a shadow she saw the night before by the garden arch, unmoving, watching, like a ghost with unfinished business. Her husband had scoffed, of course, but Elspeth read the truth in the tremble behind her painted smile. She wasn't sharing to stir drama, she was unburdening something that had frightened her to her bones. And yet it wasn't the stranger's appearance that struck Elspeth most, it was the timing of the confession, as though this tidbit had been held in reserve for when silence became too heavy. Why now? Why here? And then there was the matter of the blood-stained dress, hastily removed from view, found behind the divider in the music room hours ago, its presence acknowledged by none, its implications too terrifying to speak aloud. No one had asked the only question that mattered, not whose blood it was, but why the sight of it hadn't shocked anyone. As the guests tightened into cautious clusters, eyes darting like birds sensing a coming storm, Elspeth felt it, a shift in the room's gravity, as though something inevitable had just stepped through an unseen door. And then, like a thread snapping in a tapestry, the bridesmaid collapsed, her champagne flute slipping from her grasp with a crystalline gasp, her skin pale as frost, her body folding soundlessly to the floor. The reaction was delayed, like people waking from a dream, the slow scrape of chairs, the sudden pitch of voices, the quiet sob from someone who already knew what this meant. Elspeth didn't stir. She placed her teacup down with the precision of ritual, eyes drifting not to the girl on the floor but to the ones who had not flinched, the ones too prepared for this, too calm, too resigned. This wasn't panic, this was performance. And in that chilling realization, Elspeth saw it clearly, this gathering was never about joy. It was an endgame, a reckoning staged beneath lace and vows, orchestrated with care by someone who knew how to turn love into leverage, and silence into complicity. Whatever had begun years ago, buried beneath family secrets and polite deceptions, was finally uncoiling itself in the open, and tonight's collapse was only the first note in a symphony of consequences someone in that room had been composing for far too long. The celebration had unraveled so precisely, so elegantly into chaos, that it almost seemed orchestrated, as if some ancient conductor hidden within the bones of the house had lifted his baton at just the right moment, and summoned centuries of silenced whispers to awaken from the walls. It wasn't just an accident, it felt inevitable, rehearsed in the creaking of floorboards and the breathless hush of long-sealed doorways. The scream that shattered the evening's fragile elegance hadn't come from a guest or even the bride, it had come from the walls themselves, or perhaps the very soul of the house, a place too old and too wounded to stay silent any longer. The bridesmaid didn't fall, she collapsed violently, suddenly, like a marionette whose strings had been severed by an unseen hand. Her body hit the floor with a dull finality, her limbs bent wrong, her eyes already glassy with shock, and in her last conscious gasp, she looked not at anyone, but towards something no one else could see. The champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered with a soft crystalline whisper, a sound far too gentle for a moment that instantly rewrote the room's air. No one moved. The music had stopped mid-note, the air itself hanging like a held breath. The groom stood rigid, a fixed point in the sea of stillness, eyes wide not in concern, but in some strange half-remembered recognition, as though the girl's face had stirred something buried rather than mourned something lost. The bride, her veil trembling with the faint breeze of open doors, looked as though she had turned to marble, too horrified to speak, too stunned to scream, a part of her realizing even before the others, that this was not just tragedy, it was inheritance. And amidst this frozen moment, Miss Evangeline Gray moved, not with panic, but with eerie calm, the kind that only comes from having seen too many truths laid bare. She was the sort of woman people forget until they need to remember. Her presence at the wedding chalked up to family tradition, a figure kept more out of politeness than love. But now, she stepped forward with quiet purpose, her gaze cold and sharp behind gold-rimmed spectacles, as though she were reading a script only she had ever seen. She didn't bend to the girl, or cry out. She reached for the fallen glass, lifting it delicately, tilting it toward her nose. The scent was deceptively lovely, citrus and petals, but beneath it was something else, faint and unforgiving, bitter, metallic, familiar. Aconite, belladonna, no dramatics, just a slow calculating kind of poison, the kind that offered a window for reflection before the body collapsed. Evangeline didn't speak. She didn't need to. She understood what the others couldn't yet say aloud, that what had just occurred wasn't the beginning of something, but the continuation of something very old and very unfinished. As the room began to stir, servants whispering, guests clutching pearls and each other, an ancient voice broke through the rising noise, Lady Winthrop, brittle and sharp-edged, her voice like something cracked and re-glued too many times. Her gnarled fingers gripped the serpent-shaped brooch at her collar as she hissed, almost to herself, that dress should have stayed buried. After what happened last time. Her words hung like smoke, and slowly faces began to shift, eyes widened, memories returned. The original bride, the aunt, the pond, the full moon. Her body found face down in the water, her gown blooming around her like a shroud, her mouth open in eternal surprise. The same gown now worn by her niece. 3 nights ago, it had been drawn from its cedar tomb with reverence, pressed, perfumed. But Evangeline had smelled it then, beneath the lavender sachets and mothballs. The scent of rot, of memory, of something unfinished. The doctor's arrival changed nothing. He pronounced vitals, barked vague instructions, but even he could feel the thick, ancient dread in the air, like something watching from the rafters. The family splintered, shadows of guilt flickering across their faces, the brother whose eyes darted too quickly, the father whose hands wouldn't stop shaking, the grandmother muttering in a dialect no one could identify, her words more curse than prayer. By twilight, the house had hollowed into something else entirely, less a home than a theater dimmed between acts. Guests slipped away into cars and shadows. The bride sat still, untouched, her gown pooling like spilled milk, her eyes unfocused. Evangeline moved silently through the halls, the house groaning with each step like it remembered what she remembered too. In the drawing room, she found the gown again, folded, but carelessly, as though someone couldn't bear to touch it any longer than necessary. She placed a gloved hand on the fabric, a new stain near the waist, fresh, wine dark, but it was the older one, near the hem, hidden beneath careful stitching, that chilled her dark, rust-colored, oxidized into the threads. Blood, old but not forgotten. The dress hadn't just survived 2 deaths, it had absorbed them. 2 women, 2 weddings, 2 untimely ends, and the same cursed silk winding around them like a spider's web. This was not coincidence. This was design. And someone, perhaps even someone standing in that very room earlier, was ensuring that history didn't just repeat, but escalated. Evangeline's gaze hardened. The veil had been lifted, not just from the bride's head, but from a past everyone had tried to forget. And as she returned to her seat beside the fire, where her knitting still lay untouched, she let the flames reflect in her eyes. The night was not over. The next scream, she was certain, would echo louder, and it would come not from fear, but from revelation. Because whoever had started this thread of death all those years ago, had just picked up the needle again. The air was too still for a celebration, too watchful, as if the house itself had braced for something unholy cloaked in lace and vows. It began, not with a scream, but with silence. The kind so dense it swallowed laughter mid-breath, turned music brittle, and settled like a shroud over the revelers, just as the bridesmaid crumpled beside the cake table, her collapse so sudden it resembled execution more than fainting. A champagne flute rolled from her hand, trailing a single crimson drop not of wine, but something far more deliberate. The guests froze in an unspoken pact of disbelief, their expressions etched in porcelain dread, while the groom's gaze skittered from the fallen girl to the bride, with a strange detachment, as if he'd mistaken her for someone else entirely. The bride herself stood hollow-eyed, her veil quivering not from the breeze, but from some inner tremor of recognition. And in the corner, near the towering hearth where ancestral portraits stared on unblinking, sat Miss Isadora Thorne, a woman rarely spoken of and never expected, her invitation attributed to obligation rather than affection. Yet she remained unmoved, her demeanor precise, her gloved hands folded with the serenity of a woman attending a ritual long foretold. She didn't glance at the body or the weeping maid, instead her eyes fixed on the wedding gown's hem trailing near the hearth, a fine lace edge now dusted with ash and something darker. She had smelled the gown earlier, when curiosity led her to trail her fingers across its preserved silk. It had reeked faintly of damp cedar and lilies left too long in a vase. Poison, yes, but not in the glass. Something older, embedded in tradition, stitched into the very seams of this cursed heirloom. The police arrived, courteous, pompous and unprepared, cataloguing hysteria rather than homicide. But Isadora watched one guest too closely composed, her mourning calculated with the precision of a stage performance. Grief, genuine grief, trembles. This was choreography, and it wasn't the first time. In whispers carried on garden paths, and within pews cloaked in incense, the village had long muttered of the family's bridal curse. Each daughter doomed, each ceremony followed by scandal or tragedy. Disappearances, deaths, ruined reputations washed downstream like confetti after the storm. The matriarch had buried 3 sisters, one drowned in the orchard well, another vanished before the ceremony, her shoes found outside the window. The last was buried in a dress nearly identical to the one worn today, only hers had borne a hidden tear, carefully mended with red thread, as if binding flesh and fate. Isadora remembered the smell of that thread, she remembered the scream that had come too late, and the silence that followed, which never truly lifted. And now, seated beside the cold fireplace, with the gown draped across her knees like a patient awaiting diagnosis, she traced a hidden seam with her fingernail, and felt it a line of stiffness where fabric shouldn't resist, something sewn inside. As servants murmured, and the wind whispered secrets through the floorboards, Isadora smiled faintly. This was not coincidence. This was continuity. Someone had learned to use legacy as weapon, stitching vengeance into ritual and hiding retribution behind lace and pearls. She would not call the constable, she would not shout accusations. No, she would watch, quiet as dusk, until the culprit slipped again. And when they did, the house would remember, and this time, so would she. Because this was not just another ruined wedding. This was the third act in a play centuries in rehearsal, and Miss Isadora Thorne was done pretending she didn't know her lines. The storm had passed hours ago, but the house still groaned beneath the weight of things unsaid, its rafters creaking like tired bones, its silence thick as secrets left too long to rot. Eleanor Wren stood alone in the attic of the Hawthorne estate, surrounded by the scent of moth-eaten cloth and aged cedar, her breath shallow, eyes fixed on the old trunk half buried beneath forgotten holiday decorations and boxes labeled in trembling handwriting. Something had pulled her here, an instinct maybe, or something older, woven into her blood. Her fingers brushed the lid, dust blooming into the air like ash from a long-dead fire, and when it opened with a reluctant sigh, what she saw inside didn't belong to this world, not anymore. The wedding dress, once luminous, was now the color of old parchment, the lace brittle, the silk folded with a reverence that suggested fear more than sentiment. But it wasn't the gown's age that made her breath catch, it was the dark stain spreading across the bodice, like a wound still weeping after all these years, refusing to be forgotten. And then a second shock, a delicate seam near the hem, recently unpicked and clumsily restitched, as though someone had hidden something within and later tried to erase the act. With a careful tug, Eleanor pulled loose the thread, and out slipped a small velvet pouch, its contents whispering of grief. Inside, a silver locket, warm despite the cold, containing a photograph of two identical sisters, one smiling with the grace of a performer, the other staring with the quiet ferocity of someone who knew what it cost to be overlooked. Pressed behind the photo was a folded piece of paper, its corners crumbling, its ink faded but legible. I took her place, but not her piece, and now the dress belongs to both of us. Eleanor's knees gave slightly, her mind unraveling a tale her family had long buried under layers of polite silence and altered memories. She remembered the half-told stories of a wedding that had ended with shattered glass and blood smeared across the altar, of a sister who had vanished without a trace, and a groom who'd left the country before the honeymoon could begin. In the library, buried behind dusty volumes of forgotten classics, she later found her grandmother's diary, its entries stitched with anguish. The truth emerged slowly, like a bruise blooming beneath pale skin. The groom had loved the wrong sister. Her great-aunt, desperate and coerced by a patriarch drunk on legacy, had donned the dress meant for another. She had stood before the guests, a ghost in silk, pledging vows that weren't hers, stealing a life in the name of duty. But guilt, Eleanor realized, stains deeper than blood. The true bride had tried to flee, to speak, but had been silenced, and what followed was covered up, rewritten, erased, but not forgotten. Not by the house, not by the dress. Downstairs, the family was preparing for another wedding. Eleanor's cousin, radiant, naive, slipping into a cycle she didn't yet understand. Eleanor knew then that the past wasn't through with them. Some legacies are heirlooms passed down in rings and recipes. Others are woven into fabric and silence. That night, as wind howled through the chimney and the house sighed beneath the weight of truth, Eleanor returned the locket and letter to the dress's lining, but added her own note. This ends with me. Because some stories, no matter how elegantly hidden, demand to be finished. And upstairs, behind the attic door that now refused to stay shut, the dress waited, not cursed, not haunted, but heavy with the truth of women who were never given a voice, and daughters who must now choose whether to wear the lie or burn it. It was a venom-laced evening when Elira de Souza unlocked the door to the oldest wing of the Havleys' library, where moonlight seeped weakly through warped glass, dissolving into shadows that seemed to breathe. Time itself hung suspended in that stillness, so thick and solemn that even the act of breathing felt like a transgression. Before her, laid out with almost ceremonial precision, were two bridal gowns, one new and radiant, the other old and withered like a memory too long buried. They faced each other like a mirror of timelines, as if the past and present had been forced into confrontation. Elira's gaze held a quiet resolve, the kind born from years of listening to things unsaid, of hearing the whisper beneath the silence. Her eyes traced the identical stains on both gowns, starting at the left shoulder and bleeding diagonally over the heart. It was no careless splash of wine, no smudge of errant lipstick. This was deliberate. A message written in the language of silk and blood, an accusation dressed in white. Someone had not merely worn the dress, they had weaponized it, resurrecting a past transgression to haunt the present, compelling every witness to remember what they had spent years trying to forget. Then, from beneath a dust-covered chair in the corner, she retrieved a handkerchief, its fabric yellowed with age, its edge marked in fading sepia ink. The dress was mine, but the bride was not. Elira's breath caught in her throat, like an echo waking from deep within her memory. That fateful wedding night began to replay in vivid flashes. The bride's sudden insistence on changing gowns at the last moment, the groom's fleeting expression of unease as he watched her return down the aisle, and the one guest whose name had never appeared on the invitation list yet managed to linger in every photograph taken. The next morning, as sunlight began to creep across the stone floor, the maid discovered the bridal veil shoved carelessly beneath the best man's suitcase, crumpled, torn as if hastily concealed. Poisoned doubt spread through the house like ink in water. The best man, once rumored to have been close to the bride, was dragged from his breakfast in a storm of whispers and suspicion. His face pale, his voice shaking, he protested, "I've never touched it. Why would I?" But his trembling hands betrayed him, and each word only stoked the fire of public judgment. Everyone was eager to believe the worst. It was convenient, it made sense. But Elira stayed silent. She watched, observed how his eyes flinched when certain names were spoken, how his guilt didn't stem from action, but from knowledge. He was hiding something, yes, but not the crime itself. It was not the guilty who stood out in her eyes, but the one person whose demeanor remained too calm, too rehearsed. Smiles can be masks, and this one fit too well. That evening, while hushed arguments drifted down the hallways like ghostly murmurs, Elira returned to the library. The guest book waited on a side table, worn leather cradling decades of names, signatures, and fleeting presences. She did not search for who was here, but for who should not have been, names from old tragedies that now wore new faces. And there it was, a name from another lifetime, the same one tied to the original stained gown, reborn in this generation under a new guise, hiding in plain sight. This was no ghost, no ancient curse, it was vengeance, a calculated reckoning brewed over time, stitched into tradition, and unleashed at the altar of memory. While the household tossed and turned in their beds, choking on secrets and half-truths, Elira folded the two gowns together, and returned them to the wardrobe. She left behind a single slip of paper, handwritten in her elegant hand. Not every gown is a lie, but every lie eventually wraps itself in one. This was no longer merely a mystery, it was a prophecy. And somewhere, the next scapegoat was already being measured for their role in the fabric of the past. The flickering candlelight sent nervous shadows crawling across the faded wallpaper, as Evelyn Hartley stepped into the cold, forgotten halls of Briarwood Estate, a place not just built with brick and timber, but woven together with secrets, shame and silence. The scent of dried roses and something far older, something like dust and grief, hung in the air, wrapping around her like a memory she'd never asked to relive. Every corner whispered things that should have stayed buried, and the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that listened. On a lace-draped table by the mullioned window rested a guest book, seemingly innocent, but opened recently, its pages disturbingly untouched by time. Evelyn, a woman known for her precision and control, reached out with fingers steady from decades of legal crossfire, but now trembling, not from fear, but recognition. Her eyes scanned the signatures until, halfway down a page dated the night of the Hawthorne wedding, the one that had ended not in vows but in a vanishing, she found it, Helena Ashcroft. The name struck her like a verdict. It didn't belong there. Helena had died tragically in a fire 33 years ago in this very house. Her body never fully found, her veil still smoldering in the remnants of her bedroom. Yet the signature was not faded, not aged. It was recent, ink still dark and assertive. Either someone had dared to forge the name of a long-dead woman, or Helena had never truly left. Evelyn's breath hitched. This wasn't a clerical slip, it was a message, a challenge. She recalled what the locals still whispered in pubs and parlors, about the bride who disappeared from her dressing room, the groom found hours later rocking in the attic whispering nursery rhymes, and the chapel door marked not with a sign of welcome, but a glove, Helena's glove, driven into the wood with a rusted pin. Evelyn hadn't returned for nostalgia or reconciliation, she had come for what had been buried under generations of polite silence and rewritten history. As she made her way upstairs, each stair groaned with the weight of decades, she felt the house watching. In the nursery, untouched since the incident, she found the veil, again, but now it hung like a warning from the edge of an empty cradle, stained with something dark that no longer smelled like wine. Beneath it lay a brittle envelope, aged but unsealed, containing a single line in handwriting. Evelyn knew from old letters, "She wore my dress, but not my fate. Helena." The veil had vanished years ago after the tragedy, presumed destroyed, yet it had reappeared at a Viennese antique auction just months ago, bought anonymously, now returned home like a cursed relic, drawn back to the source. Evelyn's blood ran cold. In the hall mirror, for a heartbeat, she saw not herself but another, a woman with her aunt's eyes, the same knowing tilt of the head, the same rage buried beneath practiced charm. This was no haunting fueled by superstition or whispered tales. It was a revenge carefully dressed in ritual and memory. Someone had returned, not to remember the past, but to relive it, and correct it. The next morning, Evelyn visited the town clerk under the pretense of curiosity, but her request was precise. The original registries from both 1992 and 1960. The older book was reluctant to open, its spine cracking like old bones. But when she reached the page, her breath caught again. Helena's name appeared twice, once for her own wedding, and again decades later, in nearly identical handwriting. It wasn't a clerical accident. It was a deliberate echo. The pen had never been dropped. It had merely waited. Someone had been moving beneath the surface for years, erasing, correcting, rewriting history until truth itself became a ghost. Evelyn closed the registry with shaking hands, not from fear, but realization. The truth hadn't died in the fire. It had lived on, passed down like a cursed inheritance, stitched into family heirlooms and retold in bedtime stories no one realized were confessions. The veil, the dress, the name, they weren't relics. They were warnings. The curse was never some supernatural punishment. It was justice unfinished. And whoever wore that veil next, whoever dared walk those aisles blind to the blood beneath the lace, would not be the first to vanish before the altar. But they might be the last. Shadows clung to the hallway like cobwebs spun from silence, thick and undisturbed, as Alira moved with deliberate care, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, not from cold but from instinct, as if the very air within Hawthorne House had teeth. The walls seemed to lean in with every step she took, pressing memories into her skin, faded laughter, distant sobs, the rustle of fabric that never quite sounded like it belonged to the living. She had been watching Micella, the bride's mother, all evening from the corners of rooms and behind polite smiles, observing the delicate tremor in her fingers as she poured tea, the way her eyes flinched every time someone uttered the word dress, like it was a loaded gun. But what intrigued Alira more was not what Micella did. It was what she didn't do. She never looked at the dress, never spoke of its legacy, and every time laughter sparked at the bridal table, her smile stiffened as if guilt was wrapped like silk beneath her skin. Not the kind of guilt one wears for being found out, but the sort that festers from what remains hidden, what others never discover. When Alira finally knocked at her door, it opened immediately, too immediately, and Micella stood there like a portrait painted in grief and dread, her face pale with the quiet expectation that something long buried was clawing its way up. Alira understood then. Micella hadn't been waiting for her but for the moment when silence would finally collapse under its own weight. The bedroom reeked of vanished joy, the lavender-scented air stale with nostalgia, the furniture arranged as though time had been frozen deliberately, and on one wall, encased in glass like a holy relic, hung the dress, a thing of ivory and sorrow, with lace that seemed to breathe. Micella sat, her fingers worrying the edge of the bedspread like she was unraveling something only she could see, and then she spoke. "It wasn't supposed to be hers," she whispered, voice soft as morning silk. "It was meant for my sister." The story unfolded in pieces, each word a stepping stone over a chasm of pain. Thalia, the older sister, was once the bright jewel of the family, bold and unbreakable, until the night before her wedding when something unspoken cracked beneath the weight of secrets. There had been a fight, violent, hushed behind oak doors, a confrontation with their father about a lover no one dared name. Thalia had wanted to run. Instead, she vanished. And Micella, stunned and shamed, was thrust into her place at the altar, wearing the very dress her sister had chosen, lips mouthing vows. She never intended to speak. Hours later, the celebration ended with screams. They found Thalia's body in the reflecting pool, her skin blue, her eyes open as if trying to remember what betrayal felt like. They said it was a fall. They always do. But the blood on the hem of the dress, fresh, jarring, was never explained. Micella paused, swallowing hard. "Every bride who's worn that dress since," she said hoarsely, "something has happened. Accidents, madness, death. It follows them, Alira. It follows me." Her eyes filled with tears, but Alira did not flinch. Tears were never proof of truth. Sometimes they were rehearsed, sometimes reflexive. And as she listened, a quiet unease grew. The story was compelling, heartbreaking, but too refined. The gaps were subtle, like skipped brushstrokes on a painting. Certain names weren't mentioned, certain moments too easily glossed over. The confession bore the polish of repetition, words spoken aloud to a mirror so often they'd become a shield. Alira, who had spent decades listening to liars and survivors alike, knew the difference between an outpouring and a performance. Still, she offered no interruption, only a gentle nod at the right pauses, her silence not passive, but but strategic. What Micella said might have roots in truth, but the real story, the rot at the core, was still buried. And then, just as she stood to leave, offering Micella's trembling hand a soft, almost maternal squeeze, she felt it, that prickling sense that something unseen was watching. Just outside the door, in the fold between shadow and hallway, someone else had been listening. A presence barely breathing, pressed against the wall like a dark intention. Whoever it was had caught every word, but they weren't there for clarity, they were there for ammunition. Confessions Alira knew could heal, or they could be used to twist fate like a blade. As the unseen figure crept away, careful to avoid the floorboard near the grandfather clock that always groaned like a warning, Alira turned slightly, her eyes landing once more on the glass case. In it, the dress seemed to shimmer faintly, as if mocking her with its silence. Something wasn't right. The curse was real, but maybe not in the way Micella believed. Alira had seen grief used as camouflage before, and she had a feeling that this story didn't end in the past. No, this story was still bleeding into the present, and someone in this house was ready to use it again. She just didn't know yet who. Guilt has many faces. It doesn't always wear the mask of murder. Sometimes it wraps itself in silence, in the aching hope that buried truths stay buried, that the past remains asleep and still. But in places like Ravencourt Hall, where history clings to the drapes and seeps between the floorboards, guilt finds ways to breathe. It stirs the air like a long-forgotten breath, it creaks behind closed doors, and it watches from portraits that refuse to age. Miss Leona Hargrave, aged but sharp as ever, felt it that morning as she paused outside her chamber, the kind of stillness that isn't empty, but listening. A draft brushed past her, cold despite the sealed windows, followed by a whisper of motion, like a dress hem vanishing around a corner. She said nothing, but her gaze hardened, her mouth a straight line, as if it had sealed away 1,000 suspicions. By dawn, a poisonous thread had begun to unravel throughout the house, a whisper dressed as a story soaked in dread. The scullery maid, trembling and pale, insisted she'd heard weeping behind the blue door of the west wing, a part of the house no one was meant to enter. The footman, overhearing, passed it on as fact. By mid-morning, the bride's cousin was retelling the tale with new flourishes, scratches on the wall, a silhouette in the mirror, and though no one could say where it began, it was suddenly everywhere. Rumors, after all, do not need proof, they only need fear. When Lady Eveline confessed that evening, it all sounded too pat, too perfectly tragic. Her tale, the cursed gown, the blood, the lineage of madness among the Marlowe women, felt less like revelation, and more like something memorized. It accounted for the screams in the night, the vanished servant, the drowned girl, and the locked attic door. But Miss Hargrave, seated at the breakfast table the next day with her spoon suspended mid-air, seemed unmoved. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, like someone searching not for a person, but for a fracture. She had heard many confessions in her time, and she knew the dangerous allure of a tidy one. True confessions do not come in clean lines, they are jagged, unsteady, unwilling. What Evelyn had offered was a performance, and Miss Hargrave suspected the truth was hiding in what had been so carefully left out. Later that afternoon she sat beneath the east parlor window, the grey light pooling around her like old smoke. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap, forgotten. She wasn't thinking of curses, she was thinking of patterns, of histories that repeat because no one dares cut the thread. It was she who quietly asked the household to gather in the drawing room, not with drama, but with the kind of calm that made refusal unthinkable. By then, even silence had become unbearable. They came, drawn by something heavier than obligation. The bride looked like a ghost in ivory, fingers mangling a lace handkerchief. The groom stood like a soldier at war with his own doubts. Evelyn avoided everyone's eyes, her hands trembling too finely to be from age alone. Others assembled in corners and shadows, as though afraid of being seen too clearly. Miss Hargrave let the quiet stretch until it was tight enough to snap, and then she began, not with accusation, but with memory. Her voice was low and firm, the kind that makes people listen without knowing why. Curses, she said, are not born, they're built, layer by layer, lie by lie, until we forget where the truth even started. She spoke of a letter that had disappeared before it could be delivered, of a girl whose heart had been broken not by betrayal, but by duty, of a secret held for decades by someone who loved too much and trusted too wrongly. She spoke of a dress not cursed by ghosts, but by what had been done in its name, of a girl who didn't fall but jumped, because no one had ever given her a voice, and slowly, word by word, the myth began to crack. This house, she said, her gaze steady, was never cursed. It was only buried, beneath grief, beneath guilt, beneath the cowardice of those too afraid to speak. Her voice didn't rise, but it rang like a bell in the stillness. And someone in this room, she added, knows exactly who stitched the first lie into that gown, and what they were trying to hide. For a moment no one moved, no breath, no cough, just a single flickering beat, an almost imperceptible shift in one pair of eyes. That was all it took. Not a confession, not a scream, just a blink, just the truth, quietly beginning to stir in the silence it had slept in far too long. Superstition had always been a convenient prison for the Bramble family, an invisible chain they wore with pride, blaming every misfortune on whispers from the past rather than the rot creeping steadily through their present. Blackthorn Manor, a place once brimming with laughter and legacy, now echoed only with the sharp silence of things unspoken. The fabled Bramble curse, a tale woven from the death of 3 brides over 100 years, was no longer a cautionary legend. It had become a shield, a distraction, and for someone in that house, the perfect weapon. On the morning before Eleanor Bramble's wedding, the house awakened to horror. The veil meant to be worn during the ceremony was discovered drenched in blood and draped hauntingly across the nursery mirror, the same room where the first cursed bride was once said to have gone mad. Screams followed, superstition bloomed, and within moments the narrative of the curse reclaimed its throne. No one questioned how a locked room was entered, nor who would benefit from the hysteria. All eyes turned to the past, to stories of tormented spirits and vengeful brides, but none to the person pouring the tea that day. Eleanor herself, though shaken, was not dead. She claimed only fragments of memory, cold hands, a lullaby in the dark, the sound of dripping water, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Her wrists bore scratches she could not explain, and her lips trembled with things she dared not say. But while the family spiraled into ritual and whispers, Miss Imelda Cray watched, not a member of the bloodline, but a long-forgotten companion of the dowager grandmother. Imelda had seen more than she let on. She always had. Quiet, sharp, and dismissed as harmless, she noticed the way Eleanor's tea had been switched at the last moment, how the younger maid hesitated before sipping, how her pupils dilated before she collapsed to the floor, breath catching, skin paling. And still, no one looked at the cup. They looked at the veil, because the veil was easier to blame. As the sun set over the estate that evening, casting long sickly shadows across the drawing-room walls, Imelda summoned them all, gently, politely, with a voice that cut through the murmurs like a thread pulled through silk. The family gathered not out of obedience, but out of dread, each afraid of what she might say, or worse, what she might know. Imelda rose from her chair slowly, the firelight glinting off her spectacles, knitting needles still resting in her lap like quiet sentinels, and then, with a calm honed by years of listening and surviving, she spoke. The veil, she said, had not been stained by accident. It had been deliberately placed to invoke panic, a calculated act to summon the ghost everyone feared, so they would stop noticing the one thing that mattered, the tea. A drink laced with belladonna, a bitter poison that would never be questioned in a house too eager to see ghosts. But the poison had reached the wrong lips. The target had always been Eleanor. Someone had known the bridal tea would be passed around as part of the blessing ritual, a harmless family tradition meant to share luck. But it had been turned into a lethal game of roulette. Only one person had arrived at the manor, unannounced. Only one had access to the bridal chamber, to the servants' routines, to the family's secrets. Imelda turned her eyes slowly, deliberately, toward young Odette, the late uncle's daughter, estranged for years after her mother was banished amidst scandal. She had returned smiling, demure, claiming reconciliation and curiosity. But Imelda had watched her hands, her eyes, the way she walked the halls at night. Odette had not come for closure, she had come for balance. Her mother's share of the inheritance had been stolen, rewritten, erased, just as Odette herself had been. And now, Eleanor was to marry into wealth that would secure the family's survival, leaving Odette with nothing but a legacy of silence and shame. Unless, of course, the bride never made it to the altar, unless the family needed a new heir. Odette's face didn't crumble, at first. She simply stared back, silent. But her hands betrayed her, trembling ever so slightly, as Imelda laid out every moment like pieces on a chessboard. The veil was never about the curse, it was a lure, a beautiful bloody trap designed to distract. The poison was never about revenge, it was about inheritance, identity, and a lifetime of being invisible. Imelda's voice never rose, but it echoed like thunder in the stunned silence. "You gave them a ghost," she said, "so they wouldn't see the girl with a knife behind her smile." And then finally, Odette's mask cracked, not with tears, but with a bitter smile. She hadn't expected to be caught, not by her. The room sat still, save for the tick of the mantel clock, each second like a heartbeat counting down the final moment of the lie. The Bramble curse had never existed. It was a bedtime story, a myth, and Odette had weaponized it to perfection. But the real tragedy, Imelda reflected as she sat once more and took up her needles, was not that they had believed in the curse, it was that they had stopped believing in one another. In the end, the family had been undone not by ghosts or legends, but by their own refusal to see the truth in front of them. And Odette, she would not haunt Blackthorn Manor, she would simply be remembered as the girl who proved that curses aren't born of the dead, they are made, carefully, patiently by the living. Once remembered with laughter and lace, the Hawthorne wedding has now decayed into legend. A solemn whisper passed from lips painted with pity and disbelief, never spoken of in bright daylight, only murmured behind closed doors like a curse too shameful to name. The once celebrated bride stood ghost-like beneath a sky that had grown leaden as though the heavens themselves recoiled. Her face drained of all joy, her veil wilted like forgotten lilies, eyes wide and vacant as if trying to awaken from a dream that had twisted into nightmare. Moments before, that very courtyard had echoed with the chiming of silver cutlery and polite applause, but now it fell to silence, pierced only by the sharp click of shackles locking around her brother's wrists, those same wrists that as a boy, had lifted her onto his shoulders during summer festivals and sworn to keep her safe forever. The betrayal clung to the air like smoke. He was dragged away not by strangers but by the same family whose laughter once filled those halls, their faces now drawn and rigid, each step of theirs a retreat not from scandal but from the truth that they had helped bury. The groom sighed, cloaked in starched pride and uncomfortable suits, vanished before the breakfast bell rang, leaving behind empty plates, untouched flutes and a silence heavier than mourning. There was no toast raised to love, no bouquet tossed in jest, only the cold hush of ruined legacy. Whispers began even before the final guest had left, speculation wrapped in civility, eyes darting, voices low, as though to speak the full truth would somehow summon it back. But Miss Evangeline Gray did not linger for gossip. She left unnoticed, slipping through the back garden gate like a ghost retreating to mist, leaving behind only a promise to write and a glance shared with the aging butler, both understanding in their silence that some stories are too stained to revisit. Scandals, she knew, are like ink on antique parchment. No matter how delicately you blot, the shadow of the words remains. And this particular tale, stitched with secrets across generations, had finally unraveled, bleeding its poison into the open and leaving ruin in its place. As her train pulled away through the waking countryside, past hedgerows bathed in fragile morning light and villages blissfully unaware, Evangeline sat still, spine straight, fingers curled lightly over her gloves, but her thoughts throbbed beneath the calm, turning over every gesture, every glance, every word left unsaid. Evil, she thought, does not announce itself in thunder or shadow. It grows slow and soft behind locked doors and well-rehearsed smiles. The tragedy of that wedding was never just the poisoned champagne or the blood hidden beneath lace. It was the years of silence that had allowed resentment to thicken like rot in the walls. A single lie, left untouched, had been fed over the years with denial and duty, until it bloomed into legend. And in that legend, truth suffocated. Back in her sitting room, the fire casting long amber shadows across her polished floor, Evangeline allowed herself a single sip of Darjeeling and a breath drawn deep with finality. People, she thought, would rather believe in fate, in curses and misfortunes passed down like haunted jewels, than in the far simpler horror that lies in human nature. They find comfort in omens and myths because to accept that their own mother, sister, cousin might hold venom behind a smile is too unbearable a burden. But Miss Grey had seen it before, in manors draped with wealth and in cottages with paper-thin walls, the truth that darkness wears many disguises, the dutiful son, the loyal maid, the doting friend. It is not ghosts that poison wine glasses or lace veils with death. It is bitterness, carefully cultivated over years, sharpened into resolve. Jealousy, shame, vengeance, these are heirlooms too, passed with the silver and stitched into bedtime stories. And the horror is not that it happened, but that it could have been stopped. She thought of the girl, radiant in her gown, doomed by a secret older than her smile. She thought of the father who looked away, of the aunt who held her silence, of the brother whose love turned rancid under the weight of inheritance. The house would still stand, roses still bloom in the garden where blood had been washed from stone, but something essential had died there, and no laughter would ever echo in its halls the same way again. As the night deepened and the wind tapped at the windows, Miss Grey knew, stories like these never truly end. They go underground, curling themselves into the cracks of old wood and faded photographs, waiting for the wrong question to be asked, the wrong memory disturbed. And when that moment comes, they rise not with screams or wails, but with the quiet weight of inevitable consequence. Just as Eleanor was preparing to lay the past to rest, folding its memories like fragile linens into the corners of her mind, a stubborn sliver of unease rose unbidden, the missing pendant. Wisikanin. Not just any lost trinket, but the moonstone locket, a piece of haunting beauty and quiet reverence. Its silver frame etched with curling vines and a faint inscription too worn to read, passed down from the first matriarch buried beneath the weeping willow behind Wexley House. It had always lived behind the glass cabinet in the drawing room, untouched, unspeaking, yet heavy with meaning, until it vanished. No broken lock, no signs of forced entry, just gone. And oddly, on the very morning a trail of muddied footprints was found leading from the western garden to the bride's chambers, and a single red thread, vivid, deliberate, coiled tightly around the staircase banister like a blood-colored warning. In the chaos that followed, the discovery of the body, the gasps behind gloved hands, the accusatory glances exchanged over porcelain cups, it had been dismissed, quietly, like so many uncomfortable truths. A servant's mistake, perhaps. A child's mischief. But Eleanor, with her quiet eyes and sharp memory, knew that in homes like Wexley, where time feels folded in on itself and grief echoes louder than footsteps, nothing disappears without leaving behind a trace, a reason. She sat back in the cracked leather armchair, knitting motionless in her lap, tea untouched on the side table, watching the puzzle tighten thread by invisible thread. The case, as they insisted on calling it, had been wrapped up for the sake of closure, the guilty named, the motive tied with a ribbon, the newspapers sated. Yet beneath the floorboards, beneath the wallpaper yellowing at the edges, that locket pulsed with a quiet defiance, a hidden heartbeat no one dared acknowledge. Eleanor understood then that some stories do not conclude with verdicts or funerals. They linger, they settle into corners and cling to drapes. And one day, perhaps during a renovation, a child's game, or the careless pull of a drawer, the pendant would return, not as an ornament, but as a reckoning. Because secrets, especially the kind soaked into the bones of a place like Wexley, don't vanish, they ferment, and every family harbors them. Some are tender, illicit affairs tucked into love letters, debts sealed in silence, names struck from wills, but others are darker, heavier, growing sharper with time, passed on not as heirlooms but as curses embedded in bloodlines. There were no spirits whispering in the dead of night, no hexes carved into mirrors, The horror was human, shaped by envy, old wounds, and resentment grown like rot beneath civility. It wasn't a ghost who placed the bloodied bridal gown in the nursery, or drew cryptic symbols in condensation. It was someone breathing, calculating, weaponizing folklore to mask cold-blooded motive. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth: how easily we accept the myths, the convenient illusions, instead of facing the jagged edges of reality. How often we call it fate, misfortune, or generational bad luck when in truth, it's betrayal, wearing the face of tradition. So tell me honestly, if a locked drawer in your own past held something terrible but true, something that could shatter your understanding of where you come from, would you dare open it? Would you face it no matter the fallout? Or would you, like so many before you, let the silence continue, dress it up as peace, and turn the key the other way? I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Eleanor uncovered the full truth? Or is there still a hidden thread wound tight beneath the floorboards of Wexley House, waiting for the right moment to be pulled? And if you were gripped by this unraveling of bloodlines and buried guilt, don't forget to subscribe for more tales that scratch beneath the surface of polite facades and legacy-stained walls. Because in the end, every lineage carries a story. The question is, how much of it do we dare to uncover, and how much have we already rewritten as a beautiful, comforting lie?